Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Babin. I'm the proud son of a Hong Kong veteran, Alfred Babin of the Royal Rifles of Canada, and I'm the president of the HKVCA, the Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association. Our topic this evening is the fence, a discussion. Now to tonight's program. We are very near the 80th anniversary of the attack on Hong Kong, which began on the morning of December the 8th, 1941. The resulting battle raged for 17 days, beginning on the mainland and ending on the island of Hong Kong. The defenders, who included not only Canadian troops, but British, Indian, and locals, fought valiantly, but were ultimately forced to surrender in the face of the overwhelming numbers of Japanese attackers. 290 Canadian soldiers were killed in the battle, and nearly 500 more were wounded. As brutal as the fighting was, and as tragic the loss of so many lives, an arguably even more horrific ordeal was about to begin for the survivors. 1,685 Canadians were marched to POW camps in Hong Kong, including Sham Shui Po camp. 130 of them died while interned in Hong Kong, and a further 137 died after having been shipped to Japan to be slave laborers. But not only Canadians were interned in those dreadful POW camps. Viveka Melky's documentary film, The Fence, presents the captives' ordeal from a unique perspective. Let's watch a very short video to set the stage for our discussion.
December 8th, 1941. I was 10 years old.
On the whole, however, a Japanese move is expected at any moment.
The two regiments sent to Hong Kong for the first time in our military history were wiped off the face of the earth. They just disappeared.
My father was put into a prisoner of war camp. We didn't touch him for 4 years.
They all struggled for their life in very difficult circumstances. This was a starving city. In the modern world, you erase memory by removing certain contents in the education system.
The collective responsibility for the war is lacking, totally lacking.
I'm sorry you're still hurt.
The film's director, Viveka Melky, is with us tonight and is joined by Luba Estes, whose father was one of the POWs at Sham Shui Po, and by Dr. Kwong Chi-man, a Hong Kong historian. Hopefully, you've all had a chance to watch the film before this evening. For those living outside Canada, where unfortunately the film is not available, we hope that it will be made available to you in the not too distant future. Viveka Melky is a Canadian filmmaker, curator, and producer based in Montreal. She has lived, worked, and traveled in cultures where repressive regimes are dominant, which provided the impetus for her projects concerning conflict and the capacity of the human spirit for resilience. Born in the Gambia, West Africa, of Brazilian Lebanese descent, and educated in the UK before immigrating to Canada, she sees the world through a multicultural lens. She co-founded Tortuga Films in 2006 and produced several documentaries for the CBC English and French networks. Her feature-length documentary, After Circus, has received widespread acclaim. She also created and curated Warflowers, a touring art exhibition, a multi-sensorial art exhibition that enthralled visitors and received rave media reviews over a 3-year period as it traveled from its opening at Refford Gardens in Grand Métis, Quebec, and then on to the Canadian War Museum, the Visitor Education Center of the Canada National Vimy Memorial in France, as well as to venues in Toronto, Montreal, Edmonton, and Mississauga. Viveka wrote, directed, and executive produced The Fence. It took her 9 years to research, and the film includes never-before-seen archives from inside Hong Kong and Japan. For the film, she and her team built replicas of Hong Kong's Sham Shui Po prison as it was in 1941, to exact scale in Cuba, and she'll explain in her talk why she did this. White Russian and stateless when the war in the Pacific broke out, Luba Estes was transformed from a privileged 10-year-old living in Hong Kong to a starving child outside the POW camp, determined to see her imprisoned father. After the war, she became a ballerina, a theater actress, and then a CIA operative. The USA is now my country, but Hong Kong is the home of my heart, she says. Luba and her story are the backbone of the film. Through her child's eyes, we see a world torn apart by the cruelty of war. Dr. Kwong Chi-man is an associate professor in the history department of Hong Kong Baptist University. He specializes in the military and naval history of modern East Asia, particularly from the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 95 to the 1970s. He has published several books on the military histories of Hong Kong and Manchuria, and recently launched a publicly available interactive map detailing the Battle of Hong Kong. Now, Viveka, I'll turn the discussion over to you.
Up the phone and I said, "Are you the daughter of Alexandra?" She said, "Yes, I am." And that's how I found Luba in the beginning. And so I was fascinated by these drawings. I thought they were haunting in many ways. And I'd like to say, as my part in this is to talk about how we made the film, is that you will notice that we designed the fence exactly based on these drawings. We also used a drawing from London, but these were the main drawings that we based the drawing, the building of the fence in Cuba. Mike, we can go to the next. So the reason this is important is this is also taken in Cuba, where we built the camp or parts of it. This was actually thanks to John Reed, who actually helped us have this record, which was actually from his family. And it was a cardboard record. We cleaned up the sound as much as possible, and you hear it in the film. It's a radio recording. I know for many people who are listening, they would know that this was one of the first recordings where we knew that the Canadians were alive. It was taken, it was done in Japan. And so we cleaned up this recording as much as possible and have it in the film. It's just one of the examples of the work it took to get everything to Cuba. I'm going to explain a little bit how we made the film and why we chose to go to Cuba. But we did choose to film in Cayberien, Cuba, because it is on the same latitude, longitude as Hong Kong. And I was looking for the same levels of heat that the camp and that the POWs would have suffered. So we were looking for exactly the same feeling of lighting and heat, and that shows in the film. And so we searched POW camps all over the world. Some of them you're not allowed to film in, even if they are actual POW camps, you're not allowed to film in them for heritage reasons. And so we decided in the end that it was best to build parts of Sham Shui Po prison. And so that's what we did in Cuba. And I'll show you more photos of that as we go on. So we can go to the next one. The film has a lot of archives. I'd like to give credit here to the POW Research Network of Japan, who are a wonderful group of people who I worked with to find this archive. So the first two interviews that I did was with George Peterson and with George McDonnell. I was filming with them over 2-3 years. And George Peterson in his interview mentioned a Christmas, that he was forced to pretend that they were having a Christmas meal and that the food was taken away. The story is in the film, but it was thanks to the POW Research Network of Japan that we got the actual photo. So this is from Tokyo. And it is a propaganda photo. The film focuses a lot on revisionist history and on propaganda. And so this was one of the archives that we felt was really important to share in the film. We can go to the next one, Mike. Those are the actual drawings of Luba's father. And so what we had to do is we had to redraw exactly to film in the film. Patrick Binet, who is our art director, one of our art directors, redrew the photos, the images exactly, so that we could film them, which is quite astonishing because I had two very talented art directors, Greg Nowak and Patrick Binet, and they drew the photos by hand. There we are in Cuba doing them so that we could film the actual images, which were actually, I'm sure Luba's going to tell us, but they were done with Chinese brush. They were Chinese brush sketches. Mike, we can see the next one, please. Very early on, the film took about 3 years to make in total. This is Mario Davignon, who's a very well-known costume designer, and we had to have all the costumes exactly perfect to the era. Luba's hair, our young Luba, who's Darian Ramirez. We were doing everything exactly to as close as we could, because when you're making a film about something that has been forgotten or ignored or erased, it's really important to come as close to the truth as possible, which is why I'm a filmmaker who tends to put only objects and archives in the film, or objects that come from actual archives. And I can show you a little bit that later with the next slide. Mike, we can go forward. Okay, so building the fence. Let's remember that Cuba has an embargo. It's a very difficult country to build anything in. We carried, Mike, we can see the next shot also. We carried in 800 plus pieces of equipment and props to build the fence in Cuba. It is built exactly to scale of the photos that we saw, with much consulting with Dr. Kwong. The barbed wire is exact. The wood had a special mushroom that was painted on it that made the wood age in 24 hours as soon as water touched it. We, of course, tried to find as close as we could to the elements of Shamshipo, whether it was by water. Mountains were harder to get, but we managed to go by the water. And we had a crew in Cuba who were building the fence for 6 months before we arrived. I am very happy to say that when the film finished, we have a zero trace policy. And so everything was taken down and everything was donated to families there. So all the wood went to build something. Wood is expensive in Cuba and hard to come by. And so it was great that everything you see was used by very grateful chicken farmers, which was fantastic. Okay, next shot, please. Okay, so this is just showing the detail of the fence. All you're seeing has been hand painted. All the rust, these are all materials that our art directors were building and used. The lighting, everything had to come in. It was very difficult. In Cuba, if a light bulb goes, you can't just go to the store and replace it. You have to carry in everything with you. The next shot, please, Mike. So this is just a really beautiful photo taken by Patrick Binet of the fence at night. We can have the next one. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the other parts of the film. Of course, we filmed in Japan and in Hong Kong. This is Himeji Castle, for those who have been to Japan or who might know this already. And the reason I put this in the film, everything in the film was done on purpose. There was no accidents. Himeji is one of the oldest castles, and it is the castle of the samurai. It's the biggest medieval samurai castle. One of the misconceptions that I found in the 10 years of researching this film was that the behavior of the Japanese Imperial Army was under the Bushido Code, the samurai code, which was in fact not true. And so it was important to me to remind everybody, including those who were from the right wing, who harassed us while we were making this film, that it was important that the Bushido Code was one of a warrior's honor. And it was not something that was the reason that those behaviors occurred from the Japanese army to the POWs. We go to the next one, please. And here we have Dr. Tanaka and Chi-Man, who are filming with Christian Lamontagne, our director of photography. We're filming at Hiroshima. We did not tell anyone the reason we were filming in Japan to make this film. We went ahead and filmed at Hiroshima. You see the education system that is occurring. We talk about revisionist history in the textbooks. And it was on purpose. I was purposely saying something about memory and about the traces in education. And Hiroshima is one of the largest education sites in Japan, for those of you that have been. We can see the next one, Mike. These are history books. Well, they're not history books. I'm sure Chi-Man can say better on this, but they are history books where we were looking for traces of this story. I wanted to see what had been said in the books, they're mostly manga, on this story. And again, this is addressed in the film, that there is not, how do we say, the same mention as we have, the same version of this story. You know, the film was, the other reason that was very important for me is that if you erase this history, then you're erasing our history. And so I really wanted to make a point that this history was not something that it wasn't an option. Can we go to the next one, please, Mike? So this was very interesting because a film has many, many archives in it. But of course, we're talking about a story where archives are buried and hidden and untraceable and not classified. So we chose to, thanks to the director of photography, Claudine Sauvé, we came up with something called the Lomokino Camera, which is a small camera, really this big, and it rolls like this, and we recreated archives. So what we did was we recreated the feeling of war crimes and things that had occurred that we couldn't find any actual archive or trace. So we searched the world. You can see the long list of people who helped us make the film, but we could not find trace of these actual stories that were told. And so that's when in the film you see the use of the Lomokino and this black and white jumping effect. The white shroud was sent from Hong Kong. It is used in ceremony when somebody passes on. We used white shroud, the actual white shroud from Hong Kong on the bodies in the film. And you see it several places in the film also. Yes, Mike, next one, please. And that's another shot of us, Iluba's story of seeing the bodies leaving Shamshapur prison and knowing that her father was still alive. We can go to the next one, please, Mike. The makeup, I'm sure some of you have noticed the makeup, which is quite amazing in the film. It was based, again, all on research, what Berry does to the body, what Pellagra does to the body, starvation. These are our amazing Cuban actors. They were fantastic, Rafael, and that's Dominique Casbani. And so the problem was, of course, the makeup kept melting off everybody. So that was really difficult. But we kept placing the makeup back again. Mike, you can go to the next one, please. Yes, so the makeup was quite astonishing. This is Rafael. He's a very good actor from the Cuban theater in Havana. We had half the crew was Cuban and half the crew was Canadian. And again, all of this was built from images as close to the images as we could from Luba's father's drawings. The next one, please. Okay, this is a bit of a funny story because I couldn't get a bayonet into Cuba. I had to go through customs many ways. So we had to build a bayonet from wood. I think they thought I was going to take over Cuba with a bayonet, but it was not going to happen. So we had to build the bayonet despite all my efforts to get it into Cuba. So this is our very talented head carpenter, Rafael, and he actually carves the bayonet you see in the film. We couldn't get one in. We did try, but we couldn't. Here's the next one, please, Mike. And so, Mike, we can actually go forward. Also, these are all the props that we created. They're again made exactly from stories. Those are actual Japanese Christmas balls from 1941. Mike, let's stop on this one because this one's really important. So the chrysanthemum flower is the flower of the Imperial House of Japan. It is also, for those of you who might have seen War Flowers, my exhibition, it is the flower of compassion. And so it was very important for me to have actual chrysanthemums. There are in the archives, in the letters and journals, there is mention of eating chrysanthemum flowers. And so you see that happening in the film, but it was also for me a symbol of compassion and of telling a story, again, about something that really should have had more compassion take place towards the POWs. Can we have the next one, please, Mike? So this is just to show you why we chose Cuba, because I think it's very interesting. This is an actual photo from Luba's archives. I think we're looking at her mom. And you see the arches, and then Mike, you can go to the next shot and you see exactly why we went and picked Kaiberian Cuba, which looks exactly the same. And I had stamps of approval from Chi-Man all along. He has given an immense amount of time to this film. And so we recreated this scene. The signs are all hand painted. They're taken from actual archives. The signs are actually signs from the time. And there we are blowing flour in the wind with 300 people watching us. And so this was the actual filming. It was really fantastic. It was a 40-degree heat. It was very hard to do. And I can't imagine, we were hot, so I can't imagine being a POW. It was really a difficult. The crew and the actors were burning within 20 minutes. That's how hot it was. And that is the same temperature as Hong Kong. It was important for us to get as close as we could to the truth of the story. Can we go to the next one, Mike, please? Because I'm running out of time, so I don't want to talk too much. We can go to the next one too. Again, it's just a scene. And this is the last one. We had torrential rains, flooding, all kinds of things happened, giant scorpions. It's all good. It was all part of making this film. Oh, and I put a timer for myself because I didn't want to go over. So I'm going to I'm going to hand over actually to Chi-Man, who is going to talk to us, I think, about many interesting things, including the archives. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Verica, for the wonderful film and the presentation. And first of all, I really would like to thank Mike and HKVCA for organizing this very interesting event, because it is really important this year, particularly. It's 80th anniversary of the Battle of Hong Kong. And of course, I have many things to share, but I think I only have like 10 to 12 to 15 minutes. So I try to be concise. So it's a long journey, really. In short, I learned a lot from Vivica and from the making of the fence, because it's when Vivica first contacted me in 2018, I wrote several books on the Battle of Hong Kong already in Chinese. My first book on the battle was published in 2013. And then another one in 14 and 15. All of them are in Chinese, and one in English, which was a military history of Hong Kong from the 1840s all the way down to the 1970s. So I thought I know enough about the Battle of Hong Kong and the Japanese occupation. And when Vivica contacted me, I was about to really stop doing Hong Kong. Yeah. In fact, I was working on a very different topic when Vivica first contacted me back in 2018. One thing, by the way, I would like to add is that the work, I was involved in the project from 2018. So things changed a lot since then in Hong Kong and in the world. But it seems to me that it's what we did back in 2018 and early 19 was more like a preview of what is going to happen in the world afterwards, especially in Hong Kong. But anyway, so when I was involved in the project, I thought at the very beginning, I thought I was only to provide some very basic archival sources and point out the more obvious mistakes of the archives Vivica used. I thought it was an easy job. I really thought it was an easy job sending me footages, and I say this is not Hong Kong, that is not Hong Kong, that's Pearl Harbor, and so on. So I was expecting a very easy job, so I didn't even ask for much money from that. And then Vivica and her team came to Hong Kong in late 2018. It was actually a few days, almost exactly 3 years ago, by the way, Vivica, if you can remember. You arrived in 20-something of November 2018. Yes, and we had a very how should I describe it? I don't really know how to describe it very clearly, but it's an enlightening process. Let's put it this way, because I was trained as a military historian, focused mainly on operational issues or so-called larger issues. So individual experience and their emotions, their suffering is not really my thing, I thought. And I was trained as such, more or less, or I thought I was trained as such. So what I did mainly was the archival sources about the Battle of Hong Kong, as you would see in the screen. Operational documents, British documents, Canadian documents, all the war records, and so on and so on. And then I thought, yeah, that's what I do and what I should do. But then I just realized, after talking with Vivica and after leading her around in Hong Kong to see the battlefields and did the interviews. But by the way, Vivica is a very good interviewer. She just gets things out of you, and so beware. And she would extract not things that she wants, but things that in our minds that we may not be able to realize. That kind of stuff. So that's very important, in fact, because after years of experience in working on the history of Hong Kong, I almost like deliberately suppressed my sympathy to Hong Kong and its people. So only after working with Vivica, I have the idea that I probably need to do something about the suffering of the locals, of the Hong Kongers, of all ethnicities, of the Hong Kongers who were under the Japanese rule. That's one thing. And in the next year, Vivica shifted me to Japan, Osaka, and then we met Dr. Tanaka. That's another very, very important experience to me, because through our exchanges, because my impression of the Japanese, I met many Japanese scholars since I was an academic, I have been an academic for 10 years. I have a very good sort of knowledge, I thought, with Japanese academia and Japanese scholars. But Dr. Tanaka was very different. It's a very different scholar. You can't really say he's a Japanese scholar. He's just a scholar. Probably should not add that thing on him. But anyway, so he told me a lot about the almost like systematic suppression in Japan of the war memories, especially on the war crimes against the Allied civilians and the Allied prisoners of war. Very, very fortunately, things improved consistently, partly because of Dr. Tanaka's effort and many others in Japan as well. So things are slightly better, but you can see the damage of that suppression. People just don't know about. People know about the war. People in Japan obviously know about the war. They know about atomic bomb. They know about the firebombs of Japanese cities by the Allied forces. They know about the blockade. They know about starvation in Japan, but not elsewhere. Not in Vietnam, not in Hong Kong, and so on. So in fact, the wartime experience of Hong Kong under the Japanese rule was almost completely unknown to the Japanese. Many did not even know the Japanese forces had taken Hong Kong and ruled it for 3 years and 8 months. But of course, things are getting better because of the internet, because of the availability of sources, because of more exchange, because of people like Dr. Tanaka and so on. And while we work with Vivica, we started to dig up things ourselves. And very, very fortunately, it's just by chance this time. It's really by chance. I sort of stumbled upon a Japanese document from a online auction website of a Japanese document about it was basically a report written in late 1944 by the Japanese governor who was leaving his post. He was basically sacked by Tokyo for incompetence, and no one knows about this report until it was being put on auction websites. It's just a normal Japanese auction website. It was sold for $500,000 yen, not much money in reality. And we persuaded the Museum of Hong Kong History in Hong Kong to obtain a copy of this document, and they sent us an e-copy so that we can look into it, what's inside. We found two very, very important statistics. One is the number of the Hong Kong locals who were basically expelled from Hong Kong during the Japanese rule, because they knew they had not enough food to feed everyone. So the Japanese authorities systematically pushed away the locals. So this is basically the total number of people being expelled from Hong Kong from January 1942 all the way to the end of 1944. So in total, more than 1 million were being kicked out of Hong Kong under the Japanese rule. You have the total number 1094654. So it's 1,094,654 people were expelled. And even more shockingly is a list of crimes tried by the Japanese authorities in Hong Kong. So all sorts of crimes. So this row shows the different categories of crimes killing, forging military scripts, spreading rumors, attacking, robbery, and so on. And then you have this particular category of crime, which is called extraction of human flesh. So it's cannibalism. So they did try people for cannibalism. But the very cause for this situation was obviously the result of Japanese incompetence and, of course, wartime pressure on the Japanese shipping and logistics during the war. So in Hong Kong's popular memory, when we talk about the Japanese rule, the so-called 3 years and 8 months, we usually focus on how cruel the Japanese were. We did not really, in Hong Kong, we did not really try to explain the situation. We just tried to describe how poorly we suffered, how bad we suffered, and how bad were the Japanese. But then really through working with Vivica, I started to move away from the operational side of the war towards the human experience of things and try really hard to explain what happens. So you just can't blame like the cruelty of Japanese or Bushido or anything. It was many factors were like incompetence, wartime situation, and so on, individual decisions and the policy in Tokyo and the relationship between Hong Kong and Tokyo during the war under the Japanese rule. So many different factors that could really explain these things. But on the other hand, I also have the feeling that not just that is needed to be discussed, but also how all these things lead to the suffering of the people, the people's reaction during all these events. So Vivica has done a very great job on that by looking really at the human side of things, the emotional, the physical, the emotional, and all these and later psychological things entailed in all these experience. And this is very important to me, important lesson to me, because if I have to work on the Hong Kong side of things and so on. So yeah, generally it's a lot of things to share, but I don't really know. It's really mind blowing. Even I look at the documentary again. In fact, I always feel embarrassed when I watch the fans because I don't want to look at my own face and try to have a straight face and talk. I still feel embarrassed, but the other parts are really very enlightening to me, even as an academically trained historian. So it almost became my own blind spot, really, my academic training, because I sometimes have almost forcibly suppress my own feeling towards all these events. Yeah, so basically it's that. And the one last thing I would like to touch upon is the historical discourse in different places. In Canada, in Hong Kong, in Japan, you have different treatment of the same experience and this memory. And I really have the feeling that thanks to the internet, thanks to the latest technological development, the more exchanges are possible, just like this, what we are doing now. And before the age of internet, we cannot really imagine the close working closely together between people in Canada, in Hong Kong, and even in Japan, in China, and so on, in Australia, to really share their feelings about the war, share their experience, share the resources concerning the research of the war, and so on. So this is one truly multinational effort, and it's a multicultural exchange that really matters, because back in decades ago, we tried to look at these things from this almost like solely national perspective, which is good, but which is not enough, I think. So yeah, I think that would be the future, because it really highlights the common human values and experience of these things, rather than trying only to look at the things from our own perspective. So yeah, a big thank you to Vivica, and of course to her team. So, and I now hand my microphone to Luba. Thank you.
And do I speak now? Yeah. Well, I'm going to be reading. Today, I feel privileged that I lived long enough to be here to honor the memories of all the Canadians and other veterans. And I will repeat quickly what has just been said. In 1941, almost 2,000 Canadian officers and men arrived in the British colony to defend Hong Kong from a possible major attack by Japan. In anticipation of the threat, many foreigners who lived in Hong Kong, they joined the Hong Kong Volunteer Defense Force, and that was part of a British Army Reserve to fight alongside the British, the Chinese, and Indian forces. My father, Alexander Skvortsov, he a civil engineer working for one of the companies owned by the Kaduri family. He joined the volunteers. He joined, and he was commissioned an officer in the combat engineers tasked to blow up the bridges and the roads before the advancement of the enemy. The nightmare of the possible attack became a reality a weekend when the volunteers were out on the Chinese border in Fanling. And that meant my father was not at home when we were attacked. But he was there to defend us and blow up all these roads to stop the advancing enemy. The nightmare of the possible attack became a reality. During a weekend when the volunteers were out and when my father was not home, I was only 10 years old. The attack was overwhelming, frightening, and just very loud. Hong Kong surrendered to the Japanese invaders. I have 18 days, Chinman. You had 17. And the Japanese occupied Hong Kong for almost 4 years. Because my father was an officer, he was not shipped to POW camps in Japan, but he stayed all that time in Hong Kong. All his life, my father loved sketching. It was his favorite hobby. So he decided to secretly sketch the interior of the hut, which he shared with about 10 men. From the outside, I saw the huts all look the same. But to sketch the exterior without the guards watching, he walked around and he tried to remember every detail. He would walk around memorizing looking. He was very careful to hide his sketches because if he were caught, punishment would be awful. During those dreadful years, he tried to keep his mind off the pangs of hunger and the constant bedbugs everywhere. They were not allowed to use boiling water to pour over a miserable little mattress. They were not allowed to do anything or have anything to kill those bedbugs. So even during the day inside, when my father was sitting in the chair and sketching, he had to battle those bedbugs. The other thing in camp, it was a constant fear that these drawings would be found. And the punishment, as I said, would be severe. Viveka Melky, in search of authenticity, was inspired by these sketches to set the stage, so to speak, and use it in the documentary. In 2005, my sister and I put a book together with all the sketches, casual and otherwise, in a book called The Hong Kong Prisoner of War Camp Life. And on the back of the cover, I wrote, "The book contains an extraordinary and unique visual record of the conditions in which the prisoner of war of Japan lived in Hong Kong." Viveka Melky found 3 wonderful actors to play my mother, my father, and to play me. They gave powerful performances. And Darian played me, excellent actress. Naturally, I have a very special spot for her. While the prisoners were closely watched, they were allowed to assemble in different huts. Not always, sometimes. They were allowed to give lectures on a variety of subjects. A couple of men approached my father, asking him to give Russian lessons. Inspections took place once or twice a night. They would parade through and check if everyone was in bed. My father, when he was in camp, he had the front door key to his beautiful house, and the key was sewn into the hem of one of the shirts. When the war ended and the massive camp gate opened, he gathered his sketches, he rolled them up. He had 4 small books, not homemade, but camp made, and a few other items, and he bundles them up. While most of the other prisoners, they didn't know where they were. They had to gather in lines and get instructions. But my father knew his way home. He could walk it. And almost holding his breath, he approached the gate, which was open. And he walked through the fence to the other side, to freedom and home. When he got home, the house had just been abandoned, just as though someone had just been living there. On the stove, there was just a little bit of sake, which was still warm. And waiting outside the front door, was our old Chinese gardener and his wife. Before the war, they lived, we had a spacious servants' quarters, and they lived at our house. When they saw him, they were overjoyed. And without asking, they immediately started taking care of my father and doing everything for him. And they cared for him. And their job with our family was secure for life. Now, first of all, I want to explain why your father came to, my father came into an empty house. The reason is because my mother, my sister, and I were in Shanghai since mid-1942. During the Japanese occupation in Hong Kong, we starved. The only way my mother could purchase any food was by trading her jewelry. A ring for a little can of whatever. At the time we were stateless, so we were not sent to the civilian camp at Stanley. Just before the war, my father had applied for British citizenship, and he was issued papers that said we were under British protection. My mother, desperate, trying to feed her 2 young girls. So often we would just have maybe a small bowl of rice. And she would go, we had a lovely big yard, and there was nothing growing but grass. So she cut the grass, cooked it with soy sauce. At least it had flavor. So my mother, desperate, she tried to feed the 2 young daughters, but she bravely approached the Japanese authorities, and she asked them to imprison us, but they turned her down. But she said, I have papers, and I'm your enemy. But the Japanese were also having a hard time with food. In the meantime, Colonel Takanaga He was the chief of all the POW camps in Hong Kong. One day, he turned up in our house with an interpreter, and he was very polite, very polite. We asked him in, and he sat down with the interpreter and visited with us. Then the next day, he came back again and sat down. And that day, he said he wants our house. In fact, he wanted a bedroom right away. Why? To store food. And packages of non-perishable food were delivered every day by soldiers. We suspected that that food may have been meant for the Red Cross or the camp. And so that was horrible. We were so hungry, and the food was just doorway. Anyway, my mother then realized we had to leave. We have friends in Shanghai. We hadn't heard what was going on there, but my mother managed to get passage on an old freighter, passage in the hold of the ship. And they were not going to feed us, and we could only take things we could carry. But we went. And that's what happened. We went to Shanghai, and we didn't see him till maybe a month later. I remember when my mother was able to get passage to Shanghai, to sail to Shanghai. I remember how horrible she felt, because we were going to walk along the fence, and my mother said, behave as a child, you know. We never looked at the guards, never. And she said, playfully, and Darian does it beautifully, and try to convey the waves of the sea and hope that he understands. And he did. I think I'm done. I can continue, but I think I've said enough. I'm repeating a lot.
All right. Well, Luba, thank you very much for your comments. And in fact, thank all of you for speaking to us this evening. And now's the time when we'd be happy to entertain questions from our viewers. If you'd like to submit a question, just use the Q&A facility. You may have to tap your screen to make it come alive, but tap on Q&A and just type in your question. Now, we do have a question already for Luba. This is from Jerry. Jerry wants to know if your father was aware of other artists and sketchers in Sham Shui Po camp. He gives the examples of Canadians like William Allister and Raymond Quirón. Did he, so first of all, did he know, do you know of any other sketchers in the camp? Or did he think he was the only one?
I can't for sure. I don't think he never mentioned anyone else. And many years later, I spotted sketches here and there, but no, he didn't. He sketched he sketched scenes of the camp, but then he sketched people. And very often he'd do a sketch and just give it to them. Many sketches that went out of the camp to the owners. No, he didn't know.
And Jerry also wanted to know if your father did this. You mentioned this was your father's favorite activity, even before the war. But Jerry wants to know if he did this as a form of relieving boredom, or was he interested in really recording the events that took place and his surroundings in the prison camp?
Well, the thing is, my father was an engineer. He loved his work. He built bridges, but mainly buildings. But he loved to sketch. So if we would go somewhere, he would never send a postcard. You know, in the old days, people sent postcards. He would take a blank and he would sketch whatever we had seen. My father never used it commercially, never. As a matter of fact, my father, I mentioned the book that my sister and I published, but he published 18 sketches. After the war, my sister was married right away, and my mother and father and we went around the world. And in the meantime, in London, my father took those sketches and he published books that looked more like an album. And it was not to sell. I wish I knew how many he published. I know he gave to museums. He just gave it to them. And there were some very special people that he was with, and he gave it to them. He gave me one, he gave my mother one, my sister, and it was all a very private thing. Some people gave it back to me, and but I have enough because I have at least 4 or 5. But no, my father never sold any of that. He was not a very good salesman. He was not interested in that. He just loved his job. And when he was in camp and he knew that he had the ability to record, he felt the world should know what a camp was like, what the incident, it's a record. And he was determined to have a record.
And Diana wants to know, how long did your dad live after the war? And your mother too, for that matter.
My father died basically in today. I say he was in his 70s when he died. I've got the exact date. I have blanks. I'm old too. I can't remember these things. And he suffered from beriberi. And his health was not so good. But my parents being Russian, every meal had to have sour cream. My father put sour cream on everything. So maybe had he followed a diet, maybe he would have lived longer. But they finally, after going to New York and then Florida, we noticed that he had dementia. And it became worse and worse. But he died from a heart attack.
Oh.
My mother lived about 12, 15 years longer. And she also had a heart attack. So but we have such good health care now. It's amazing.
That's for sure. Now,
Yeah.
Martin lives in Hong Kong, one of our viewers, and he would like to know, where was your house in Hong Kong?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
It was on Kaduri Avenue. And actually, you know, my father always had excellent jobs. And because he had a wonderful education, actually, he went to St. Petersburg, to university there. And then because his father was in Harbin, Manchuria, and his father, my grandfather, was in the 20s the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Manchuria. So life was very, very good. And he was big noise there. And so he came back from university. He came back to Manchuria, but being an engineer, he was immediately employed by the Chinese Eastern Railway. And I had some wonderful photographs, and he was the manager of that unit. But in 1931, Japan took over Manchuria. Manchuria is a very difficult thing to study. It was Soviet, Chinese, Russian, Japanese, but he had to leave because the Japanese took over. And we got on a ship and went to Shanghai, beautiful city, and very international. And I was only a baby then, but I know that my parents had a wonderful life there. He had an excellent job, and it was really wonderful. And when the Japanese, again, they were after us all the time, they started creating problems outside of Shanghai. I remember one day that in the summer we go back to Harbin, Manchuria, where my grandfather and my mother's mother were. We'd go and visit. As a matter of fact, my sister and I were dropped off there, and we spent time with my grandmother. But I remember when we were returning, my mother, my sister, and I, from Harbin, and you come into the harbor, huge harbor. Shanghai has changed so much. And so the ship usually anchors in the harbor. You get off on a power boat holding about maybe 8 or 10 people at a time. And we were going to the shore, and suddenly a little fighter plane flew over us and tried to bomb us. And we didn't expect that. And the bomb fell right next to the boat. And you can imagine the splash. We were tossed back and forth. My father was waiting to meet us, but from a distance, he wasn't sure whether we were on the boat, but we were. And there were incidents all the time, and it was definitely time to leave. And then, and I don't know how, but the Kaduris, who have a lot in Shanghai, and a lot in Hong Kong, they offered a job to my father at the Hong Kong Engineering and the Construction Company. And so when we arrived, it was smooth sailing. And after about 6 months, my father decided he wants to build his own home on Kaduri Avenue. And the funny thing is, where my father, built, it was just a block and a half from where Lawrence Kaduri lived. He was in the small house, and we always laughed and teased them because Muriel, Michael's mother, was very petite. And the main thing they wanted was a big garage because they had all those cars. But anyway, we built a house on Kaduri Avenue. It no longer exists because what they did, I don't know when, a while ago, they tore it down and they constructed 2 houses on the property.
I think that happens in a lot. That happens in a lot of places. I think that goes on. Chi-Man, if I can interrupt for a moment, a question for you from Jerry. There always seem to be different totals in concerning the forces that faced each other. Sometimes we hear there were 10,000 defenders, sometimes 12,000, 14,000 invaders. The Japanese 30,000, 50,000. What was the right number, and why these discrepancies in the numbers?
In short, thanks for the question. In short, there was some misunderstanding concerning the numbers. The origin of that discrepancy was probably the official British report. So at the beginning, they believed they were attacked by 2 full Japanese divisions. And nowadays, the things are fairly clear to us, is that we have both sides records. So it really depends on how we calculate the numbers. If we put everything into account, the defenders had around 13,500 to 14,000 men, including and excluding the nurses and so on, and auxiliary helpers. And there are several thousand civil defense workers, but we usually discount them. So the garrison had around 14,000 men. That is pretty sure. And then the attackers, and usually the people who counted the numbers don't include the naval and air forces. So there were several thousand land support and personnel, and the fleet that attacked Japan was actually, it's not very big, but there were many men because there were many small ships. So around 40,000 men in total from the Japanese side, including the naval and air forces. That's a pretty safe number. In terms of ground forces, the Japanese division that actually attacked Hong Kong had only around 14,000 men, but it was supported by a full artillery brigade and a lot of independent artillery units. So the total ground forces would be as many as around 30,000. That's more or less. And I would like to say a few words on Mr. Mr. Cameron Wood's words. Yes, indeed. Usually we'd say the history was written by victors, but in fact it seems that as none of the side could completely eliminate each other, so the survivors could write their own version of history, just like in Japan's case. So there are so many different attempts to hide this and that. And that leads to my very quick comment to another question about apologies. The Japanese government, may be a surprise to many, is they actually apologized for many times. They apologized for so many times that you have an Wikipedia entry of the list of Japanese apologies. So officially they did, but on the other hand, the details of the war crimes and so on are not really widely known in Japan. So yeah, these two things stand. Yeah.
Can I say something? Can
Yeah.
you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Of course, I have extreme feelings about the Japanese. Is it true that victorious military soldiers are excused from, I mean, when they arrived in Hong Kong, the cruelty was unbelievable. Is it true that they're allowed to rape and to do things publicly and not be punished? I keep on saying that to people. Would you know, Chinwan?
It's a rather complicated question, but we can now say something about this for certain clarity. First, between the surrender of the garrison, which took place on the 25th of December, and the official Japanese ceremony of taking Hong Kong, which took place on 28th of December, there was a 3-day gap. So usually you have a saying that the Japanese soldiers were allowed a 3-day gap of doing whatever they want. So to an extent, it was true, because certain units failed to control their soldiers, especially for the rear area soldiers, the porters, the Japanese porters, artillery, gunners, engineers, and so on. But for the combat troops at the front, they were busy trying to round up the Allied soldiers, take them to the prisoners, to the concentration sites, the points, the barracks, and so on. So they were busy tidying up the battlefield to deal with the dead bodies and so on. So it was actually a mess. And in many cases, especially in areas like Causeway Bay, parts of Central, things were pretty messy. But on the other hand, in places not under Japanese control, things were still sort of under British police control. For example, parts of the city of Victoria, Songwan, and of course the western part of Hong Kong Island, things were pretty quiet. So it was not a official statement to the Japanese soldiers saying that, yeah, you are allowed to do whatever you want. No, there was never such an order. In fact, the Japanese army actually punished some of their own soldiers for the wrongdoings done after the battle. So there were actually cases like that. So it was a very messy affair, and people would have the impression of that was an official order, but there wasn't an official order, in short. Yeah.
You know,
Luba, Dave, one of our viewers, wants to know, other than an extreme shortage of food, were you mistreated in any other way by the Japanese, you and your family?
well, I had an older sister who was very pretty, and after the occupation, there were a lot of drunk soldiers, and if they'd walk by your house, they would bang on the door and things like that. So you were in danger, but especially a young girl or woman. So now, at one time, we could take parcels to, I think it was Shamshipo, and that was very difficult because my mother was torn. She would give us something and then keep something for my father. And very often when we'd be eating, and she would eat a crust of bread, and then she said, "Oh, take it. I'm not hungry. Take it. I don't want." And we used to take things to the camp, my mother and I. And one day, my mother came back with cans of carnation milk, and she must have you know, she in the far, at least in Hong Kong and Shanghai, women had a lot of jewelry, the real thing. And so it was going. And that carnation milk, and we were hungry. My mother punctured a hole, and when she poured it, it was dirty water inside. The holes had been filled, and she had sent 2 to my father, and that just killed her. My mother once went to the camp, and actually it's recorded. There was near us, I mean, just across on Kaduri Avenue, if anyone knows it, there's a long staircase going down. And over there was the Argentinian consul general, a youngish guy who spoke Japanese. And he had a 4-year-old daughter. And the daughter became sick. And he wanted a doctor. He went to the Japanese authorities, I need a doctor. Anyway, to cut a long story short, she got more and more and more ill, and she died. And he wanted to bury her, but he had no transportation. And he asked the Japanese, it's my daughter, I need to bury her. And he got no help. So he carried her dead body and walked quite a long way to bury her. I know during those weeks before he was evacuated, he and his wife used to come to visit us just because they were afraid to go anywhere other than just in the neighborhood. And the consul was just, he was practically imbalanced. They would sit down and then suddenly he would pick up the table and overturn it and, you know, scream. This is, by the way, all recorded on a website. And so I think, I mean, they were so cruel, but that was cruel. He spoke Japanese. He tried to help people, but it was just terrible. For example, one day when that Colonel Takanaga came to us, Takanaga never was rough with us, never. He was very stiff. And he told us that he spoke French. He didn't speak French, but he did understand that we came from Manchuria. And that rang a bell. He was probably on the front there because my mother mentioned something and he was very familiar with that region in the Russian language. And so my mother told me and my sister, don't say anything in Russian because I have a feeling he understands. We couldn't offer him anything, not even tea. We had nothing. And one day the doorbell rang or knock on the door, and the interpreter arrived, a very nice, intelligent, young Japanese. And we could see he was very nervous. And he came and stiffly sat down and said, I want to tell you, I feel so terrible about the behavior of my countrymen over here. They are not like that in Japan. It's terrible. I'm so embarrassed and I'm so upset. He said, I can't do anything to help you, but I can take a letter to your husband, he said to my mother, and I'll give it to him. Well, having seen so much cruelty, there was no way you could trust anybody. And we felt terrible about it, but my mother did write a letter in Russian, very nondescript, non-committal, and gave it to him. But while she was writing, we suddenly heard a car drive up to our front door. And that never happened. And so this poor man, who was not supposed to come, he stiffened and he got up and he stood. I went to the door and there was nobody there. So we should have trusted him, but we didn't.
Well, Luba, that leads to another question from Dave, and for Viveka or Chi-Man. When you were making the film, did you face any excess scrutiny or censorship from the governments, either in Japan or in Hong Kong?
I can answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
Chi-Man, I can answer that question. First of all, Dr. Tanaka has received several death threats to his life in the time that he has been making his work. He lives in Australia. He comes in and out of Japan, but when he speaks, there's often the right wing who is protesting. I received death threats when I was making this film, when we were in Japan. But I want to say something, and I'll address the last part, which is slightly more sensitive, as we all know. And that when we started making this film, Hong Kong was under a different government. So I will keep that question broad, and I'm sure everyone can understand. We were almost finished making the film when we had to return to Hong Kong. Well, I chose to return to Hong Kong to film what was occurring, but it was a complete surprise. It was not supposed to be part of this film. But what I want to say actually about this subject, and thank you for the question, is that the right wing is all over the world, and dictatorships are all over the world. So we did see that we were receiving certain suppressions and censorship. But for me as a filmmaker, that is the luxury, and the reason I came to this country is because I get to use the voice that I have, and I'm very grateful for it. And we have made the choice to address certain things in the film. But one thing I love about this film is I do feel it's timeless. And I would like to honor George Peterson, who we know passed away. And I asked George Peterson and I asked Pat, his daughter, before I put his voice speaking about freedom and how it isn't free. And I'm talking about today. I'm not talking about yesterday. I come from a West African country. I've seen freedom disappear. So that question, thank you for it, because it's one of the core reasons that I do my work, because I'm allowed to, because I'm sitting here in Montreal. The luxury of sitting in a democracy is something I don't forget. And so, yes, there are not only, I take my hat off to people like Dr. Tanaka and to Tamaki Matsuoka, who is not in this film, but who will be in a film called Alouette, which will feature Douglas Reese, another veteran, which is coming out next year. And I take my hat off to people like that who have history and who have to hide it. And Tamaki hides the 250 interviews of the last imperial guards that she has done. She hides them from her own government. And that's not acceptable. And that's a way of suppressing history. And so if I can do our small part, thank you, Chiman, for saying this is a multinational film. This is a film about freedom, but around the world, not just in this story. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think that's an appropriate place to bring things to a close this evening. We have quite a number of people who've sent in comments thanking you, for all of you, for producing the film, for directing the film, for being part of the film, for sharing your experiences and your opinions in the film. It's all been very complimentary. So let me thank you. And let me thank you in the audience for joining this evening. If you haven't had an opportunity to watch the film already, hopefully you will. It's free on CBC Gem, free to anybody in Canada. So please take an hour and a half and watch it. It's well worth your time. And just before you go, I want to advise everyone of a special event which is coming up on December the 4th at 9 p.m. Toronto time. The Consulate of Canada in Hong Kong is holding its annual commemoration ceremony at Saiwan War Cemetery. The ceremony will be live streamed on Facebook. If you look at our HKVCA website, www.hkvca.ca, you'll find information on how to join. For you, Chiman, that's going to be on Sunday, December the 5th at 10 o'clock in the morning, but here in Toronto and in central Canada, it's 9 o'clock, and the other time zones will be able to figure it out. The HKVCA's mission is to educate Canadians on the Battle of Hong Kong and on its effect on the survivors and their families. And I hope you found this and our other previous 6 virtual events have contributed to supporting that mission. And if you've missed any of our previous events, you can watch the recordings at www.hkvca.ca. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this evening. Good night.